This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll make a start in a few moments. We're just waiting for a few more people. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So firstly, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nicola Aylward. I'm Head of Learning for Young People here at Learning and Work Institute. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is the first in a series of 4 webinars that we're running, exploring different aspects of good practice in the design and delivery of pre-apprenticeship programmes. So Learning and Work Institute's work on pre-apprenticeships is kindly supported by JP Morgan. It's focused around different ways in which providers from across Europe and other parts of the world deliver pre-apprenticeships to secure good outcomes for young people. Through this work, we have developed a series of case studies, films, and other practical resources aimed at providers. We've also delivered events that bring providers together, and we're currently facilitating a programme of peer learning activity. All of the resources that we have developed are available free of charge on our website. So as we're all very aware, across the world, the coronavirus pandemic has hit young people particularly hard, both in terms of disrupting their education and training, and also reducing the labour market opportunities that are available to them. For these reasons, it's particularly important to ensure that young people, particularly those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, have good access to high quality pre-apprenticeship programmes that can really enable them to overcome the barriers that they face and make positive and sustained transitions into apprenticeships and the workplace. In this context, it's really important that pre-apprenticeship providers have a good understanding of the impact of their programmes, how and why their programmes make a difference to young people's employment outcomes, and that they're able to evidence this effectively. So I'm particularly pleased that we're able to offer this webinar, which is about evaluating your pre-apprenticeship programmes. I'll hand over to my colleague Faye Sadro in just a moment. Before I do so, if people could please mute their microphones throughout this session. There will be opportunities for feedback and discussion, but you're also very welcome to post questions in the chat box as we go through. So as I said, today's session is being delivered by my colleague Faye Sadro. Faye is Head of Evidence and Evaluation at Learning and Work Institute. So Faye, thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Thank you so much for inviting me to the session today, and hello everybody, welcome. As Nicola said, I'm Head of Evidence and Evaluation here at Learning and Work Institute, and the purpose of the session today is really to provide you with an overview of why evaluation is important in relation to our pre-apprenticeships and training programmes. Now, I'm really conscious that some of you may be very familiar with evaluation as a term and an approach. Others may be brand new to this as well. What I'll try to do today is provide you with a bit of an introduction to evaluation, identify some key concepts and approaches that will support you to either, whether that's undertaking evaluation yourself, commissioning it, but then also using the findings from evaluation to really support that continuous improvement of your particular programs that you're focused on and evidence the positive impact that you are having. It is going to be interactive today. There will be breakout sessions. I will ask you questions that you're very welcome to answer within the chat that a number of our L&W colleagues will be monitoring today. Do say hello in the chat. Obviously, I'm less familiar with some of the pre-apprenticeship programs that are happening across the network. So it'd be lovely to say hello, even though it is virtual. So please feel free to say hi and just introduce yourself in the chat as well as we go. And myself and colleagues will keep an eye on that too. So as Nicola said, if everyone could be on mute during the plenary session, it means there's not any feedback. You can hear me quite clearly. But if anybody does want to make a contribution, you're very welcome to sort of raise your virtual hand or again ask questions in the chat box themselves as well. And these are some of the key things that we will be covering today. But first, I wanted to get you thinking about evaluation as a concept, as a term. I wanted you to consider this question that is on the slide here. So what role, if any, and it might not, does evaluation play for your particular programme or your wider organisation? Could you just jot down some answers in the chat? It might be sort of the first things that come to mind when you think about evaluation in relation to your pre-apprenticeship programme, or it might play a very real part in what you're doing at the moment. And it'd just be really good to understand where people are landing with evaluation as a concept across the different programmes that you're working on. So any contributions in the chat, or if anybody would like to contribute and say something, then do raise your hand and we can come to you. Okay, great. Thank you, Sabine, Edna, who have contributed there. So yes, impact assessment, definitely something very well linked to kind of evaluation as a broader concept. And yes, Edna, I think many people are kind of starting out on a journey around evaluation and thinking about how to use evidence to inform their practice as well. Any other contributions from colleagues? Great, thank you. Well, I'll move on then, but please do include some of those thoughts in the chat as we go, and again, colleagues from Learning and Work will be able to monitor that. So I wanted to at first discuss the value of evaluation itself. And kind of what is that value really? So why do we undertake evaluations and what are their value? And I think predominantly there are three reasons for this, but as you can see here, they are not all mutually exclusive. So the first is around learning. So many commissioners or people who want to undertake evaluation, they want to understand if a programme is working how they expected, if people and systems are benefiting from it, and how we maximise the benefits of that particular programme or intervention is sometimes what we call it. Learning can also focus on how to replicate success or avoid challenges in the future. And evaluation really allows that real laser focus on some of these issues. So ultimately, evaluation is about learning. It's about learning about what we do and how to make our programs of work most effective. The other key area is around management. So some evaluation is about informing ongoing program development. We often see this when we evaluate either smaller programs of work that want to evidence how to potentially scale up delivery or deliver more effectively with the resources that you already have. So again, how do you maximize and optimize that efficiency in that delivery as well? And finally, there's accountability, which we all have. Some commissioners just simply want to they require that evidence of the intervention working to justify either ongoing funding or make the case for more investment. And sometimes we need robust ways of doing that. We need robust evidence generated for us to be able to answer those questions around accountability. And evaluation is a really excellent way of being able to do that. But as I say, these things, they interconnect, they're not mutually exclusive. And ultimately, evaluation is really about learning. Now, you'll have seen, hopefully, and be familiar with a number of key outputs that the Learning and Work Institute have developed over the last year or so to support the design and delivery of pre-apprenticeship programmes. And this online resource, which you can see here and access here through the link on the slide, has a significant section on it around kind of evaluating your programme. And I'd really recommend that everybody kind of goes back and re-engages with that and examines that in a bit more detail. And this should be useful to you, both if you commission evaluations or you undertake them, or want to understand where the evidence comes from when you want to make the case for that future investment or refinement in your design or your delivery of your particular programme as well. And there's plenty more detail in that online resource. So I would recommend you go away and access that. Now, I wanted to move to our first activity before I get into some of the detail about kind of key concepts and approaches involved in evaluation. And I'd like you to break out into small groups to consider the question on the slide here. So what would you like to better understand about your pre-apprenticeship programme? I want you to go away, have a think about that, talk in small groups together. And I think one of our colleagues at LNW will put us into breakout sessions. Consider that for about 10 minutes or so. And it'd be great if somebody from the group could then feed back to the wider plenary about some of the key kind of questions that you have or areas that you want to potentially examine or ask of your pre-apprenticeship programme in more detail. So Dilbag, or another colleague who is going to do this for me, could we please pop into our breakout sessions now, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.
A concern around how to track outcomes and the impact of interventions over the medium to long term. So relatively easy to capture the immediate impact of a programme, a set of activities, but when young people move on and hopefully progress into employment, more challenging to keep in touch with them and to be able to evidence those long-term outcomes. So any hints and tips around that I think would be helpful. Somebody else raised the point around constantly reviewing programmes. So whilst it's great to evaluate a really comprehensive evaluation at a single point in time, to be mindful that the context is constantly changing and that there's a need to constantly review what you're doing. And I guess that's particularly the case over the last 18 months, where the pandemic has really changed things, particularly for young people. And a final point was made around the most effective ways of engaging programme participants in evaluations. So thinking about creative approaches and what type of activities are appropriate for particular types of participants. And that's it from group 3. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Jackie, who would be feeding back from your group?
Well, I don't want to put Martina on the spot, but Martina very helpfully offered to provide some brief feedback. Thank you, Martina.
No problem, Jackie. Just bear in mind my dog snores beside me, so if you're hearing a weird background noise, it is my dog snoring, so apologies in advance. I suppose very similar to the previous group, the main points from our discussion was to capture how to capture the real impact on young people, not only when they're finished a program, but the longer term impact as well. So 2 years down the line, are they still in their apprenticeship? How's it going? If they're not, why not? So it's how they capture that kind of information. Also, social return on investment to look at a program. So who does it impact? Is it only the young person that's taking part in it, or perhaps is it a wider community impact or family impact? So it's how to capture that information. And then again, capturing information on how well the companies are working with the participants on their pre-apprenticeship programs, and how well the company's networking is going as well. So how do you capture that kind of information as well? And then just a general capturing of what works and what doesn't work on a program, and how do you pull that into the next program, things like that. So I think I've captured everything there. Feel free to jump in, Jackie, if I haven't.
No, that was a very good summary. Thank you.
Thank you. That is remarkable. I can hear your dog. That's incredible. And finally, Kat from the group that we were in. So I think there was 3 groups, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So could you just give us a quick summary of the discussion there?
Yes, there was discussion on what people would like to better understand, and there were some points raised about engaging employers in the programs, and how some participants would like to understand better ways to do that, and ways to decide on which apprenticeships people should progress into, how to make these decisions, and on outcomes. We discussed harder outcomes of programs and how those could be measured in terms of progressing into apprenticeships, or progressing into different levels of apprenticeships, but also softer outcomes like confidence, self-esteem, and how those could be measured. So those are the main points that we discussed in our group.
Great, thank you. I think there's a real range of things to kind of cover there, and it's not only about thinking about, well, how do we potentially flex a design around evaluation around a pre-apprenticeship program that actually some of the support could look quite flexible as well. So us being able to determine kind of what works, or aspects of our delivery that works, can actually be a little bit more hidden when we think about pre-apprenticeship programs in particular. And I'll cover some of that hopefully in the next sort of 20 minutes or so as well. Thanks everyone for engaging in that. So we'll move on then to ask a very simple question of what is evaluation. So I guess put simply, it's all about understanding if and how something has worked or not. So evaluation helps us to understand how a policy or a program or a project, or sometimes what us evaluators might refer to as an intervention, is being or has been implemented. So we really need to understand and get under the bonnet of a project or a program of work, understand how it works, and understand whether it works in the ways that we expect it to. It should also look at, any good evaluation should also look at the effects it has on different types of stakeholders, and why, basically, and really try to understand why people have different experiences and different outcomes as well. Good evaluation should be implemented before, during and after an intervention to gain really clear insights on how the programme was designed and delivered and the effects this has had on the outcomes that we observe. It should be really clear, credible and transparent and robust. And what I'll do is I'll spend the next few slides kind of talking about how we potentially get there to produce those credible and robust findings as well. But I was also having to think about, what do we need to think about in terms of pre-apprenticeship programmes themselves? And when we think about evaluating pre-apprenticeship programmes, and what are some of the opportunities and challenges that we face? So some of the opportunities include kind of understanding kind of experience. So we want to really understand how and in what ways different types of stakeholders experience the programme. Now, these could be your programme delivery staff. How well are things going, working? Are resources put in the right places? Are staff happy with how they're delivering and when they're delivering? What is the experience of young people themselves if you're taking part in a particular programme too? And if we know this, we can ensure that the experience for everyone is optimised, and evaluation can also identify differences in experiences as well. So when we think about, we can examine issues that look at things like maybe potential unequal access to a pre-apprenticeship programme, or why different groups of young people are experiencing the programme in different ways. And without the support of evaluation, it can be quite hard to develop good evidence to kind of give us those findings that can help us to action issues or problems or challenges that might occur. With finite budgets to kind of run our programmes, evaluation can help pre-apprenticeship programmes to determine where resources are best placed to optimise the effectiveness and maintain really good results as well. You may also want evidence of how to scale up, potentially change focus, or replicate the success of your pre-apprenticeship programme within a different context. That might be in a different geographic location. It might be with a different group of young people. And actually, with good evaluation, it can help you to identify the key ingredients that actually make up what makes the programme successful, and how to potentially transfer that into a different context as well. But of course, we've kind of covered some of this in our discussions just now, but there are some really key challenges to think about when we think about pre-apprenticeship evaluation. The first is the really boring stuff, but important: time and resource to actually deliver evaluation activity. So this is one of our biggest challenges. I think when we think about evaluation, given restrictions on timescales for delivery and budget, this means that we should, as best as possible, us as the commissioners of programmes or the delivery people of pre-apprenticeship programmes, we need to build knowledge in different types of evaluation so that we can consider carefully what evaluation is right for your programme and at what times. So we've talked about things like value for money, we've talked about understanding what works about delivery, and we've talked about impact. But what does that actually mean when we think about evaluation approaches? And again, we'll talk about more of that in a moment. Our programmes are also commonly sort of multifaceted. Now, what I mean by that is that your programme of work can be personalised or tailored to young people. That means that not every young person is experiencing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. And for evaluation, that can be a little bit challenging to then go on and identify kind of what aspects of programmes work. However, this complexity doesn't mean that your programme can't be evaluated. And there's actually some clever ways to kind of think about and approach evaluation to take account of some of this as well. Because we always, we all operate in kind of complexity and messiness, but evaluation can be tailored around that too. So I'll move on then to kind of cover what types of evaluation are kind of right for your programme. So some of this might be familiar to you, but I'll kind of take it a little bit back to basics. So there are three main types of evaluation. There is process or formative evaluation. There is impact or summative, what sometimes called summative evaluation. And there's economic or value for money evaluation. So for a full understanding of whether an intervention has worked, how, why, and for whom, and at what cost, all three types of evaluation are required, but they're not always commissioned for lots of different reasons that we've already kind of discussed about time, resource, budgets, etc. So a process evaluation is all about understanding what can be learned about an intervention from the way that it is delivered. So again, we've already talked about in our groups about what activity seems to be more effective than others. What is it about the personalisation that makes a difference for a particular young person or supports them into to progress or into an apprenticeship or employment? Your process evaluation can get you there, get you some way to understanding that. An impact evaluation is about understanding what has changed as a result of your particular intervention or programme and trying to isolate that impact and measure it robustly. An economic or a value for money evaluation examines whether the benefits produced from an intervention outweigh the resources associated with that particular programme, so all the money and resources that you've invested in it. So over the next couple of slides, what I'll do is I'll go through in more detail about the first two types of evaluation that you see on the left of the screen here, process and impact, as these are the most common that we would use to really get under the bonnet of a particular programme of work. Economic or value for money evaluation, I've made some suggestions in our further reading at the end of this presentation today. If you do want to know more about that, you can read more on that. And that includes also approaches to social return on investment when we think about what is some of the social value of some of the work that we're doing as well. That also includes some further reading there. So I'll start with process evaluation first. So a process evaluation is about developing an evidence base on the key successes and challenges encountered in the delivery of an intervention. So a process evaluation can help you understand why you may be seeing certain outcomes improving, staying the same, or actually sometimes getting worse. And it helps to explain the how and the why bit of when we examine the outcomes that we are getting, helps to get under that bonnet. Now, some of the key questions that we can ask a process evaluation are included here on the slide. And we use a number of methods, so approaches to getting to the core of that evidence and gathering that evidence to help us decide whether something is working or not. Process evaluations typically include qualitative, so that's kind of non-numerical data, to look at some subjective topics such as perceptions of how well the intervention has been delivered, or explore what participants' experience of the intervention has actually been and what they've got out of it. So typically that'll include things like interviews with project participants. It also might include interviews with project staff to understand how things are going. It might include things like focus groups as well. So that's getting a group of potentially young people, delivery staff together to discuss how the programme has been delivered and whether it's achieving kind of what it needs to achieve. It also might include other things around observations, or we might ask participants typically to take part in participatory methods, things like recording diaries, for example, about what their experience is like. And these can be really useful tools, particularly when young people are experiencing the programme of work slightly differently. So some might be attending kind of more one-to-one sessions, for example. Some might be on the programme for a short period of time. Others might be on a much longer period of time. And using a range of different qualitative approaches can help you to capture the richness of that data as well. So these are some of the things that we would typically employ when we think about undertaking a process evaluation. What are some of the kind of topic areas that we would cover? Well, that can kind of include an examination of how marketing and recruitment strategies have worked. So actually, how well has the programme done in terms of recruiting, say, young people from your target group? Are you doing that successfully at the moment? Are you not? What are some of the key challenges and successes within that? You can also look at things like your internal project management arrangements and thinking about whether your resources are being used in the best way possible. You can look at staffing and training and the quality of the delivery of your pre-apprenticeship programme as well. And you can look at then range and diversity of participation. So I've mentioned it before about kind of talking to young people, giving them plenty of opportunity to engage in the evaluation, to be able to kind of gather that rich experience that you want to get. It can also explore things like partnerships. Now, I know one of the key areas that we talked about in our breakout group was actually employer engagement. So thinking about the extent to which your employers are involved in your pre-apprenticeship programs and how you can engage them in the most optimal way. Again, you can start to include employer feedback into your process evaluation to understand sort of what's the motivation for getting involved. How can you engage employers more effectively in the future as well? And these can be with employers that are both actively involved in your pre-apprenticeship program, but also ones that aren't. These might be people that are on your wish list to include. And these types of stakeholders should be an important part of your process evaluation, particularly if you're undertaking that process evaluation at a point where you want it to inform future delivery, and actually there's opportunity to flex and adapt your model of support and what you're delivering for young people in the future as well. So these are some of the key things to kind of think about around process evaluation, whether that means you're commissioning evaluation or you're kind of delivering some of that yourself. So moving on then to talk about kind of impact evaluation. So impact evaluation helps us to understand whether the intervention has achieved what it set out to, and it identifies the changes that have actually occurred. So depending on the timescales of your impact evaluation, it seeks to examine both the short and the medium-term impacts. Okay, so a short-term impact might be building kind of confidence in understanding kind of what skills are needed for pre-apprenticeships and going on to apprenticeship programs. A medium-term one might be those progression ones that we've already talked about in our breakout sessions. So either progressing on to an apprenticeship program itself or going on to find employment as well. And so we can ask ourselves in an impact evaluation some key questions that you can see on the slide here. So these include kind of both, kind of what outcomes, both intended and unintended, have occurred. Have different groups been impacted in different ways? So kind of some of our approaches in impact evaluation can help us to understand some of that. And also, can the intervention be reproduced? And what are those key ingredients to reproduce kind of that success that you might have identified through your impact evaluation too? So these are some really important questions for your pre-apprenticeship programme. This might be about answering those accountability questions, but it's also about that ongoing learning as well. Now, impact evaluations are commonly categorised into several different types. We sometimes call these kind of experimental or non-experimental impact evaluations. Now, the experiment part refers to approaches that we sometimes use in impact evaluation, which involves something called a counterfactual or a comparison group. Now, this is effectively the observed outcomes from what we would call a control group, that comparison group that didn't receive the intervention, so they don't take part in the pre-apprenticeship programme. And we compare them to the outcomes of those people who have taken part in the pre-apprenticeship programme. And what this does is this helps us to identify the extent to which the outcomes that we observe through the evaluation can be attributed to the intervention itself and not something else. So we can ask questions like, would this change have occurred anyway when we use experimental designs? Now, I appreciate this is on the more complex side of impact evaluation, and this is not necessarily something that would be suitable for your pre-apprenticeship programme or training programme, but it's important, I think, us as people who are designing and delivering some of these pre-apprenticeship programmes to understand that these things are possible and they help to isolate that impact. You can then confidently say with some of those results that the changes that have occurred were because of your programme and not something else going on. And again, that can help with our ongoing learning, it can help with our level of accountability, and it can help you to try and understand, well, what does my pre-apprenticeship programme have to look like in the future for me to either replicate or change some of the findings and the outcomes that we see. Now, similar to some of the methods or approaches we would use alongside things like comparison groups, if they are possible in impact evaluation, we also use things like surveys. Now, surveys or questionnaires, you might know them as. Now, these might be really familiar to you. I think we all forever fill in questionnaires and surveys throughout our working lives. Now, we use these in evaluation to ask particularly young people who are going through the programme about the impact of that programme on them. And what we do in evaluation sometimes is that we ask young people to complete those both before they start taking part in your pre-apprenticeship programme and then afterwards as well, so that we can look at what we sometimes call distance travelled. So actually, how far has that young person come? How confident were they feeling about kind of apprenticeships and progression at the beginning of their programme compared to how they feel about it at the end? And the idea is, if you know or you want to understand whether your programme of work is working, is that actually there should be some positive changes in that post-evaluation survey. You want to see those rates increasing in things like confidence, in things like resilience. Now, there are ways in which, I know a question that came up from one of our breakout sessions about, well, how do you measure some of this? How do you ask people about confidence? How do you ask people about resilience? Now, it's really tricky, is the first thing to say, but there are ways in which you can do this through survey work that are more indirect ways of asking people about improvements in confidence, improvements in knowledge as well, about understanding what a career progression looks like, what are career pathways. And we have a number of tools that we use at Learning and Work Institute that are freely available online that are what we would call validated tools that you could include in things like pre and post surveys as well, and looks at distance travelled. And again, the reason why I mention things like pre-post surveys is that, again, they further help us to produce really robust evidence of areas in which a pre-apprenticeship programme is working and areas where there might be room for improvement as well. Okay. Now, impact evaluation does use qualitative and so non-numerical qualitative approaches as well. So we regularly do things like interviews and focus groups focused around impact. So what have you gone on to do? Now, this could be about measuring change over time and looking at change over time. So, you know, typically evaluations that might be commissioned over the longer term would look to engage young people after they've finished the programme. So maybe 3 or 6 months after they have taken part in the pre-apprenticeship programme, to understand where they are now and how they feel about the skills that they have built. Because actually, some of the things that we work on in our pre-apprenticeship programmes, we won't be able to observe kind of, or people might not be able to identify in themselves. And they won't be able to do that in the short term. They won't be able to do that, you know, right at the end of the training programme. They can maybe only do these things 3, 6 months, 12 months after the programme has ended. And when we think about the way we commission our evaluations or undertake evaluations, take that into consideration. Think about the timescales that you want to deliver your evaluation all over. And actually to really start to identify some of those longer term impacts, we have to do evaluation over the longer term as well. So, I've got a raised hand. So Nacho, would you like to come in at all?
Just a quick question. If I understood well, you say you have validated tools to measure, for example, these soft skills or things that are not so obvious. This is on your website and is available to.
That's right. So we've got a tool that we can put a link into the chat, that we have got a range of validated questions that look at measuring things that we sometimes call kind of softer or core skills. So these are things about confidence building, motivation to learn, improving things like career aspiration as well, things to do with self-efficacy and taking ownership of kind of one's progression. We have that tool on our website, which is freely available. And the idea is that you can select some of those tools and kind of drop them into survey tools if you would wish to use them on your programme of work as well. Okay, great. So I guess an example, and I want to drop in a few examples that might be familiar to you around sort of evidencing kind of impact in particular. This example here is from the Second Chance School, who do use pre and post surveys to collect changes in young people's social and health outcomes as well. And this supports Second Chance to track the effectiveness of their programme over time as well. So my understanding is that they do this at kind of key points in the programme to understand that whether they're on track with the outcomes that they want to achieve. They examine that distance travelled, and so that they can compare the difference between responses before and after people have taken part in the programme. So this example is to show that I guess it is possible. It's worth thinking about, opportunities to embed things like pre and post testing. When would be a good time to do this? Is that at the recruitment and onboarding phase? When could you ask young people to take part in a post survey? Is that straight after training, or could that be at a point where you engage with them sometime after they've left the program as well? And it's worth thinking about these timings and thinking through when this could happen, but know that it's it's an important element of any impact evaluation. So I wanted to focus on a key activity that happens during an initial planning and mobilization stage of any good evaluation. And this activity is called theory of change. And this is really common as a starting point for many evaluations. Now, theory of change or logic models might be a familiar term to you. They're used in lots of different contexts, but I wanted to talk about it within the context of thinking about planning for your evaluation, or planning the commissioning of any evaluation, or thinking about evidencing your impact as well. Now, this could be a whole day's training session, so I have tried to distill it down into a couple of slides, but very happy to kind of take questions as we go if there are anything kind of more specific as well. So let's start with, what is theory of change? So put simply, theory of change is a process of systematically mapping the problem that the intervention or programme is trying to address, the change aims to bring about, and also the causal chain of events that are expected to bring about that change. So, sometimes I flippantly call it, it's just a big plan of what you're going to do. It maps it out systematically, and it links to the changes that you want to happen as a result of your programme activity. Programmes that we evaluate, of course, don't work in a vacuum. So the theory of change process also helps us to map out the contextual and the external influencers, so things like economic, social, environmental factors that may have an effect on the design of our intervention and could influence the outcomes that we observe. So the example that I've been using over the last year is of course, COVID. And the impact that may have on the successful delivery of your pre-apprenticeship programme, but also the outcomes that you see as well. And theory of change, once we've mapped out what we want to do and how we want to get there, we can then think really clearly about, okay, well, what external things might have an effect on the change that we want to see? What external things might have an effect on the way in which we deliver this particular programme of work? And these are things that are really important to map out and for us to consider, particularly when we then think about our findings. So when we get our findings spat out at the end, well, okay, now let's go back to that context, those external factors. What has influenced some of those findings and some of those outcomes as well? And our theory of change process helps us to think about those things in kind of a systematic and logical manner. As an evaluator, we often host and facilitate theory of change workshops with our funders and stakeholders. So you may well actually have been part of a theory of change workshop too. And it's often a really good opportunity, particularly internally, if you want to run a theory of change workshop or think about how you develop your theory of change, bring your staff members in, bring other people who are part of that design and that delivery process to think about, okay, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And where do we want to get to? And what are some of the changes we want to occur? And theory of change can be a very good consensus building exercise, particularly when we think if our theory of change, our pre-apprenticeship programs are, you know, something that is very large. You know, you might have staff that are involved in just one aspect of your pre-apprenticeship program, but it's important that they understand, you know, what the whole process actually looks like and where we want to get to. And theory of change offers a real opportunity to build a bit of consensus amongst internal teams as well, and everybody understands where it is that you're trying to get to. So, as I've mentioned before, theory of change is a widely used approach, not just in evaluation, but also actually in strategic and organizational planning. And when organizations often use it when they're setting out their strategic objectives as an organization, again, as a tool to help unpick sort of how programs are meant to work and why it produces the intended and unintended effects that it has. So theory of change helps us in evaluation to move away slightly from the does it work question, so just the yes or no, does it work, towards that kind of what works for whom and in what context. And these are often called sort of theory-based evaluations, but actually they should be, I think, kind of underpinning all the evaluation work that we do. Now, I just wanted to share a quick example of a theory of change. There's a lot of content on this slide, so don't worry too much about engaging with some of the detail. But I wanted to show you that often theory of change is in diagrammatic form. It can kind of look however you want, as long as it includes some key bits of information. So this quick example is a theory of change of a made-up pre-apprenticeship project, but it should chime with some of the activities and the outcomes that you're each trying to reach. Effectively, the columns here act as a bit of a prompt about what component parts are important to include in your theory of change. So this ranges from the original rationale or problem that we're trying to tackle, to the human and financial inputs that we invest. So that could be money and the investment that you receive there, but it could be also our program staff, it could be our partners, it could be employers. And then it moves on to the activities that we want to deliver that can then lead to the changeable outputs, outcomes, and impacts that we expect to see as a result. And this is a great way of kind of breaking down everything that you do. The arrows that link each factor to another is called something called the causal pathway. So this is your logic of how one thing leads to another. This goes from left to right. So we can't kind of, you know, without our activities, we can't achieve our outputs or our outcomes. And the theory of change should always be seen as a bit of a dynamic tool. So we mentioned earlier that actually, how do we map how our pre-apprenticeship programs have flexed and adapted to things like COVID, for example, or they've had to change context, the way in which they've delivered? Your theory of change should be something that you constantly revisit during the lifetime of your pre-apprenticeship program, because, you know, all programs of work have to flex and adapt, regardless of things like COVID. It could be to do with the local context in which you're working in. It could be about changing because of labour market change as well. And actually, the theory of change should be something that you revisit each time your program of work changes as well. So what I'll do is I'll take you through kind of this example, because hopefully this will help you to understand kind of how to develop theory of change and some of the content that is useful to include. So the first is around the kind of rationale. So that's your first step. And that involves outlining that problem or the need that you need to address. So think about things like, what is your project trying to achieve? What problems is it trying to solve? You can consider issues at sort of a national kind of context or a local context as well. And they should be mapped out here, because actually you should be able to link back your impact. Is that answering those initial problems, those questions that you have? Your inputs involve breaking down the resources which are going into the project. So that could be financial or non-financial. So for example, X amount of funding, your providers, your partners involved in the design and delivery of your pre-apprenticeship program as well. Your activities, that should provide a summary of the activities, the services or the products produced as a result of your inputs. Now, your activities are your opportunity to start to map out everything that is on offer as part of your pre-apprenticeship programme. So that may well include sort of group work, and that might include one-to-one support, that might include any sort of wraparound support that might be based online or virtually, for example. And it's important to include all of that because it needs to feed into the latter parts of your theory of change. So your outputs, they happen as a direct result of your project. Now, I often describe outputs as the things that you can count. So that might be the number of, as you see here in the example here, the number of program starts, the number of learners completing a program. These should be your expectations. So, you know, when you write down how many young people you want to engage in your project or program, how many delivery partners or employers you want to be involved in your program, map these here in your theory of change under your outputs. Because if you don't achieve those particular numbers, the idea is that you should be able to look back in your theory of change to understand why you haven't been able to reach those numbers, for example. Your theory of change can help with that when we think about the context and the external factors that you've mapped through your theory of change as well, and to help answer some of that if there have been particular challenges or indeed key successes as well. Your outcomes are the changes in things like attitudes, behaviours and skills that you expect to happen as a result of your intervention. So you should be able to measure outcomes during the lifetime of your evaluation as well. These should be things that you could examine through sort of a short or medium term evaluation, for example. So you can see here in this example, these are some of the things that we've already been talking about in terms of what you're trying to achieve with pre-apprenticeship programs. That could be things like increased kind of aspiration. It could be about building knowledge of the workplace in general or of particular sectors. Your skills might be about improving things like resilience, including improving things like ICT or other specific skills. And you also might be able to measure progression outcomes as well. So looking at kind of, you know, the number of young people progressing into an apprenticeship or positive employment or education outcome. Now, by measuring these through your evaluation, you can start to identify whether your programme of work is actually working. Map these out. These are things that you then prioritise to measure during the lifetime of your evaluation. Now, your impacts refer to kind of your high level goals that you expect your project will contribute to. So, for example, that could be kind of what does success look like in 3 or 5 years' time? Okay, so say your programme of work has been running for 5 years. What's the impact of that? These are sometimes your sort of, you know, world peace kind of types of impacts that you might not necessarily be able to measure during the lifetime of your evaluation, but they're things that you want your pre-apprenticeship programme to contribute to. And that might be about, you know, young people achieving sustained positive outcomes in apprenticeships and employment, for example. You might not be able to measure that during the lifetime of your evaluation, but certainly your pre-apprenticeship programme should be contributing to that wider impact, whether that's at a local or a national level, for example. So these are some of the things that are typically mapped out in a theory of change. And they are the basis upon which we often design our process and impact evaluations that I've already talked about. Now, you might never do a theory of change of your pre-apprenticeship programme, but it would be useful if you commission an evaluation to ask whoever is doing that evaluation to produce a theory of change so that you can understand the direction of travel of your particular programme of work or the things that are going to be examined through your evaluation too. So hopefully this is a useful tool that you could maybe take for your pre-apprenticeship programme, but also other things as well. So there is also an example of, as an evaluator, you look for things on Twitter that are funny to do with evaluation. It's potentially only a joke for me, but famous imperfect theories of change that might be more familiar to some of our UK delegates today are these that probably you've recognised over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, that in effect, you know, these visuals that were used by the UK government to encourage people to stay at home, to protect the NHS, to save lives. These are effectively really short and simple probably imperfect theories of change. It helps to describe the activity, the outcome, and then the eventual impact that you want to see. So just to say, everyone is using some form of theory of change at the moment for good. We've talked a little bit about commissioning evaluation, because I'm very conscious that some of our participants today might not actually do evaluation themselves, but might ask others with specific expertise to undertake evaluation of their pre-apprenticeship programs. And I'm really keen to hear from you, and we won't break out into breakout groups, but for those with experience of commission and evaluation services, I'm just really keen for you to share experiences of that, if you have any. So what has worked well or less well about commissioning evaluation services? That might be about on your pre-apprenticeship programme, but it might be something else as well. Is there any advice that you could offer to other providers who are commissioning evaluation at all? And is there anything that you might do differently next time? Because I think, we all learn a lot when we commission services or deliver services as well. And it'd be really great if others who have done that could share some of that experience as well. So do share any thoughts that you have in the chat, or very welcome for somebody to raise hands to kind of chat their experience through if you have any.
I think Nacho has raised his hand.
Oh, hi. Sorry, Nacho.
That's all right.
Hi.
Hi. Well, just to share what we did, and it was really helpful, is also a design evaluation. That wasn't not like one of the options, but one of the organization that we contacted to our first experience in that, they highly recommend this design evaluation. That was basically reviewing our theory of change and analyzing with international, like studies, or to see if this theory of change was robust enough, or even if the design before the implementation, they should recommend some changes. For example, if you say, listen, you're talking about mentoring, but if we analyze the international studies and things like that, they should have an intensity of a weekly meeting, or the length should be 6 months, or things like that. So this, I think, was really interesting for us to have this kind of design evaluation even before you do the implementation, because you can save some money. Sometimes if the design is not correct, you can save efforts and money to readjust as soon as possible your theory of change, and also especially the activities that you were planning to do.
Thanks for sharing that experience, Nacho. I think it's a good one, actually. Evaluation not only examines, I guess, as you rightly say, kind of what your particular program of work is doing, but your evaluator should also look at, well, what does best practice look like, both nationally and globally, and what can we learn from other evaluations that have been done in the past around similar programs of work around supporting young people. And what does that look like in terms of the recommendations that we then offer to you and around improving kind of services for young people within the pre-apprenticeship context as well. And I think that's really important, and we should be asking our evaluators those types of questions about, well, what does best practice look like? What can we learn from internationally as well? And also is obviously one of the key objectives of our network as well. So I think that's a really, really great contribution. Thank you. Sabine, hi, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, maybe something a little bit similar, making some kind of sharing the activities between your teams and the evaluator. It's a little bit the same idea, I guess, but that you collect in your teams the indicators, so you collect data, but then let's say the recommendations and the perspectives comes from the evaluator in a larger sense and in another level. So that could be interesting, because you can always tell, well, it works, but he will look at the evidence and he will make some kind of evaluation of the evidences, so that you share maybe the tasks with your evaluator, and give him some other tasks, something you can do easily and others you are not able to do maybe in a team, and that helps maybe also to have another look at the evidence you can collect. That's just the same idea, I think.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot to be said for asking somebody that is somewhat independent or has a level of distance from your program to come in and examine that in a sort of independent way. I think self-evaluation is always more challenging to do. It's often sometimes our only option if we have limitations on our time and resources and budgets. However, there's some real benefits of asking an external evaluation partner to examine kind of your program of work, because often they can be able to identify things that you as someone close to the program isn't able to. So yes, I think that's a very key point. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I had some kind of thoughts on kind of commissioning kind of evaluation, and if that's something that you are considering doing in the future as well. And I talk from experience of being on both sides of commissioning evaluation, but also delivering evaluation for a number of funders as well. The first is about being really clear about your program or organizational objectives overall. So what is the bigger picture? What role does this program of work play within your organizational or program kind of objectives? It's really important to kind of set those out so that your potential evaluator understands the direction of travel of your particular evaluation as well. So don't forget those kind of organizational objectives. If you can outline kind of the key research questions, so what do you want to find out about the design, the delivery, the impact of your program? So like some of the key questions that we were considering in our breakout sessions earlier today. The more you'll be able to get back from an evaluation that produces the answers to those key questions. So that could be a really long, exhaustive list, or they could be kind of key, broad areas in which you want more information for your evaluator to kind of examine. And anything that you can kind of set out during that initial stage will be very, very helpful for your evaluator to understand what are the areas of prioritization for them to focus on. Set out what the evaluation findings will be used for. So it connects to the research questions point, but is this your evaluation about justifying that investment, that accountability? Do you want to expand the program? Providing this kind of detail will help an evaluation supplier to have that razor focus on where to focus their context, their examination of the actual program of work itself. So that's always very useful to kind of know, and you'll be able to get back an evaluation plan that fits with your kind of key objectives. When you set out the outputs that you're interested in as a commissioner of an evaluation, don't just think about that kind of final report. Think about maybe things to do with interim findings, or when it would be useful for evidence to inform your program design and delivery. This is particularly relevant for those who are delivering pre-apprenticeship programs over the longer term. And whether there's key points or moments where you would like the evaluation to provide interim findings. So these are findings that are not finalized, but they are emerging from the evaluation activity. These could be focused on things to do with the effectiveness of delivery, the effectiveness of recruitment or marketing approaches. These could be to do with the outcomes that are being observed during the course of the evaluation. And this is when evaluation really comes into its own. It can really help to inform future design and delivery of programs to make sure that they're kind of optimized and they're being delivered in a way that you want them to be, and they are achieving the impact that you want to see as well. So don't be afraid of asking or requesting for interim findings to feed into kind of your decision making. Get involved. I think as a commissioner of evaluation, don't be afraid to be active in your evaluation, even if you're not actually doing it yourself. You can ask to kind of shadow or be in attendance and around things like interviews that might be taking part as part of a process evaluation. You can attend analysis meetings or asked to look at interim analysis as your evaluation team starts to develop those things. And this can really help you to communicate kind of findings and be able to link your findings back to some of that field work or some of that evaluation activity when you're communicating some of this to colleagues or to your funders as well. And it helps us to build our own level of knowledge and expertise and evaluation too, which is always a good thing for both future commissioning, but then also if you're ever then asked to kind of think about or undertake your own evaluation yourself of a future programme. And finally, on budget, I suppose, consider the size of your programme and think about what is proportionate to dedicate to your evaluation, and also the level of robustness that you require through your evaluation. So how robust do the findings have to be? The higher and the more the more higher quality evaluation, obviously that might then cost a bit more money, and it's important to kind of really think and examine that within the context of what you want to use your findings for as well. So those are some key things to think about when potentially commissioning evaluation. So before we finish, I wanted to briefly cover how you can use findings from evaluations and produce kind of robust evidence about how to kind of credibly inform decision-making in the future. This can be quite tricky to do, but I've hopefully got a couple of examples and top tips for you to kind of take away with today. I want to cover two examples of pre-apprenticeships kind of programmes that will probably look familiar to many people who are attending today, about how they've used evidence to support decision-making. So the first is obviously is TU Dublin here. They've identified through their evaluation that they should introduce taster modules into their learning programmes so that young people improve their knowledge of different sectors in the local area. And this has since supported young people to raise their career aspirations. And my understanding is that this was done through a process and impact evaluation. These findings fed into a future iteration of the programme that was then able to produce and introduce these taster modules that then supported young people to improve their knowledge of those different sectors and improve their career aspiration as well. So a really good example of how live evaluation findings can really feed into different iterations of programmes around pre-apprenticeships. The Ballymun Job Centre example here, similarly, they undertook an evaluation of their pre-apprenticeship programme and identified a range of improvements in course design and delivery, their approach to recruiting students and how they engaged with employers as well. So covering that kind of full programme that we kind of talked about earlier in terms of process evaluation. And as a result of this, they've established a shorter term work placements for students, because they found that the longer term placements weren't working for young people and for employers. And since they've been able to kind of get more young people engaged in those work placements, because they're sectioned out into smaller kind of different placements and opportunities as well. So again, another example of how evaluation findings can feed into future iterations of delivery of pre-apprenticeship programmes as well. And, you know, the other thing to kind of bear in mind is just because these are some of the interim findings from these particular evaluations, they don't mean that, you know, this is something that all pre-apprenticeship programmes should adopt. It always needs to be considered within the context and the local context in which that pre-apprenticeship programme is operating in. So that's why it's really important to have that theory of change, to map out those contextual factors, again, to think about your findings within the context of these things as well. So, but some good examples there of how evaluation evidence can really inform that future decision making as well. And here, kind of some hopefully useful kind of top tips around thinking about when you use evidence in a credible way to inform your future decision making. I think it's really important to evidence for your evidence to inform and be well linked to your evaluation findings. So provide a really clear rationale for your conclusions and your recommendations. I think sometimes recommendations can be informed by kind of what we think as the people who design and deliver pre-apprenticeship programs, but it's important for any recommendations that you make in evaluation, in order for them to be credible, in order for them to be transparent, to have a really clear sightline back to your evaluation evidence that you have collected. And the more you can do that, the more credible, the more transparent your recommendations are, and the more likely they are to get agreement around adoption of any changes that you want to happen. Consider test and learn approaches. So I suppose this is kind of what we've talked about throughout, around gathering and sharing evidence as you go along. This is really effective for longer term programs of work. It enables you to kind of test approaches, see whether that's working, how do people react to it, what are some of the outcomes that we've achieved, learn about what works well and less well, and then you can adapt or modify your delivery. And that adaptation, those changes that you might make over time, they're underpinned by a good evidence base. These are not things that are just based on your own perceptions about how well things are going. You're actually able to relate them back really clearly to evidence that's collected from key stakeholders, like those employer partners, like other providers who might be supporting you to deliver the programme, and from young people themselves, of course, and that's really important to include them. Many evaluations now take approaches around co-designing and co-delivering evaluations with participants and key stakeholders. So that might look like peer learning, peer review approaches. So that might be about asking young people themselves about, well, what do you want to ask through an evaluation of this pre-apprenticeship programme? We at Learning and Work Institute and other organisations have run evaluations that have involved young people in the actual delivery of evaluation. So that might be training young people to undertake evaluation interviews themselves and interview their own peers about their experience. Now, not only does that actually build some of their core skills and being able to kind of take on a project, do some training, etc., it also brings a sense of credibility and a robustness to your evaluation approach, and because you're asking kind of the people who are experiencing or who have experienced that program to get involved in that actual delivery, they're able to relate it very closely to both their own experiences but those of others and their peers too. And so things like peer review groups are very useful. So when you have interim findings from your evaluation, sometimes we will go to a peer group. So that may be a peer group of young people who've gone through the programme, and test out findings with them, test out new approaches that you might want to consider as part of your pre-apprenticeship programme, and ask for their views and feedback on that as well. Again, that helps to improve that credibility and that robustness. And then finally, I think about engaging evaluation outputs. So, evaluation outputs don't have to look like very long, sometimes very boring reports. They can be more visual, they can be infographics, they can be briefing documents that are about drawing out the key learning. They could be audio and visual content as well. And I think more so evaluators are thinking about how to produce more engaging outputs to inform that kind of future delivery, but also to demonstrate the impact of your project too. If you've come to the end of your pre-apprenticeship programme, you've done a solid evaluation of that, you want to be able to communicate the impact of those findings. And to do that, thinking outside the box slightly, thinking about who the audiences are that you want to engage with, and then thinking about what that output should look like, will be really key in making sure that we actually learn about and continue to learn about what works and what doesn't when we think about pre-apprenticeship programmes. Great. So just to finish then, there is a bit of further reading if you are interested. So the first is obviously another link to our pre-apprenticeship programme toolkit, which offers some advice and guidance around evaluation. And there's also a couple of other things here around theory of change. And also Better Evaluation is a really good global website that helps you to sort of demystify approaches in evaluation. It explains them very clearly through some really good examples. And often when we do training, we refer people to kind of some of these key links too. And I can see in the chat that we will, of course, include the link to our validated tools that we have at Learning and Work Institute to support you to measure things around softer outcomes and harder outcomes too. And so we'll be able to send that on as well. So that's it from me. I just wondered if there was any questions. Sorry, I haven't been tracking much in the chat, but I can see that other colleagues at LNW have done so as well. Edna, yes, it is possible to have the theory of change page of the presentation, of course. We can share the slides, I think, Nicola, is that right, of the whole presentation too. So hopefully that's something that you can kind of refer back to. But thank you, everyone. Are there any questions at all?
Faye, whilst people are thinking and potentially posing questions, just a huge thank you for such a comprehensive and insightful presentation. I think often the concept of evaluation can be a little bit scary, and I think you've really sort of broken down the value of it and the different stages that people will go through really comprehensively. And I think, you know, the key thing is about constantly learning and improving our programmes and ensuring that what we deliver really does secure the best outcomes for young people, which is really at the heart of the work that we're doing with JP Morgan. So it very much fits with the ethos of the wider programme of work. So thank you. I don't know if anybody does have any final questions or comments for Faye that they'd like to post now, either by raising a hand or in the chat box.
So Howard's asked a good question about thoughts on incentivising participants to take part in evaluation, and yeah, things like focus groups, interviews, things like that. I think Howard, my answer is it depends who the project participants are. So sometimes it's appropriate to do so, and I think as long as young people are aware that they're taking part in evaluation, and we should be asked them to take part, but it should be voluntary to do so. But you know, I think it's completely reasonable to thank them for their time using incentives. We commonly use things like shopping vouchers, or it could be a monetary incentive as well. But I think sometimes we, you know, in terms of making sure that our evaluations are following good ethical practice, we need to kind of look in more detail about who the participant group is, whether an incentive is appropriate, but it can sometimes, in some occasions, make the difference and support and facilitate participation of young people as well. But happy to answer a more detailed question on email if you have it as well. Martina.
I suppose it's not really a question, Faye, but thanks for all that information because it was very, very useful. It's just something we done on a European project a while ago. We had contracted in an evaluator to evaluate the whole project all along. But one of the things that he did do was we invite him to all the meetings, whether it was meetings with participants or meetings with the stakeholders. And it was really good because he never said anything at them, but he just listened. And it was a really good way of him capturing a lot of information he was saying. So it might be an idea if you are having those stakeholder meetings to invite your evaluator along to them right from the beginning to the end. And then he did actually do follow up and contact them individually himself and the questionnaires and all that, but he did sit at the meetings, which was very useful.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And I think that's, I mean, us as evaluators, we would call those observations. So that's why he probably he was lurking and didn't say anything in them, because you are sort of gathering sort of, you know, evidence of kind of delivery effectiveness, the way relationships are established with key partners, things like that, in those types of stakeholder meetings. So it's very useful to get your evaluator involved, or at least invite them to things like those key meetings and get them involved right at the beginning when you're thinking about, you know, okay, we're establishing the pre-apprenticeship program now. What should that look like? You know, it's to have your evaluator there involved in some of those conversations is very, very useful. And I think the more that we as evaluators can get familiar with your program of work, who the key stakeholders are, the more that our recommendations and our conclusions can actually be useful and actually usable for your particular project as well. So yes, I think that's a great approach. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any final questions or comments for Faye?
I have a comment on something I've experienced. Just recently we were I'm in learning and work apprenticeship program going on right now, and there was a session I had to sit down with, I think we might call them an evaluator, who was just getting my experience on the program, my expectations, and my plans going ahead, what can be done better. Would that be part of the evaluation? And especially I'm interested in that question because in my programs, I want to include personal guidance, the counselors, and I'm wondering if I can use the counseling sessions as evaluation sessions.
So yes, it sounds like that those were kind of qualitative interviews that informed a process evaluation, particularly if that person was asking you things like, you know, what could be improved about future delivery and how have things been working sort of on the ground. I think in terms of, you know, using program or project specific activities as a way to almost piggyback on evaluation interviews, in principle, that's okay, as long as you're making it clear to the person who is taking part in that interview that actually it's informing the evaluation as well. Because obviously we need to be careful, again, in terms of ethics, that people are aware of how we're using their data. And the things they say to us is data. It's qualitative, rich data that we want to use. And we'll use that anonymously, but they must be aware that that's what we want to use it for. The other thing is, I suppose, with evaluation, we want to be there and not affect project delivery as such, because we want to be able to observe the project delivery as you know, the pure delivery itself. We don't want to have an impact on that necessarily as an evaluator, because that might change some of the outcomes that we observe. So as much as possible, if we can separate out the two activities so that we can observe the project delivery as it should be, or as you want it to be, that is optimal as an evaluator. However, on a practical speaking terms, you know, if you have somebody in a room at that time and after they've taken part in that project activity, to ask them to take part in an evaluation interview, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. Like I say, as long as that person's aware of what they're taking part in and how we will use the data that they give us as well. Because sometimes we have to just be really pragmatic in an evaluation, particularly when we're trying to collect all of that evidence.
That's great. Thank you, Faye. So I don't think there are any further questions in the chat box, but as Faye said, if people have particular questions that they'd like to pose to the team or to Faye, then please get in touch with us and we'll facilitate that process. Shortly after today's session, we will be sending an email out, which will include the presentation and links that have been included within the chat box. So you should have plenty of information there to be able to follow up on. And like I said, please get in touch with us if there are any points or questions that haven't quite been covered that we can provide further information or advice on. In the email that we send out after the session, we would also really like to capture your feedback around this session today. So there will be a short link within that to take you to a survey. So we would really, really appreciate it if you could just spend a few minutes sharing your thoughts about today's session, what you've liked about it, what could potentially have been improved. And I guess the final point from me is to really encourage you to sign up to the other webinars that we're going to be running. So the next session will be around using project-based learning in the delivery of pre-apprenticeship programs. The one after that will be around blended learning approaches and how they can really enhance your programs. And the final session will be around employer engagement. So all information will be in the email that we send out shortly. And I think that's probably everything. So once again, a huge thank you to Faye for her fantastic input, and thank you to everybody else for attending and contributing so fully today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So much.